For decades, Europe was often seen as a symbol of global progress. Countries like Germany, France, Netherlands, Sweden, and Italy were not only viewed as wealthy nations, but also as models for much of the world. But today, more and more people are beginning to ask a question that once sounded almost unthinkable. Is Europe becoming weaker? So in this video, we'll look at what is really happening and where Europe may be heading next. Stay tuned. Europe is a continent made up of dozens of countries with different political systems, economies, and cultures. It is not a single country, but a collection of nations connected through trade, security, and policy. Most of these countries are part of the European Union, an economic and political bloc that links member states through a shared market and coordinated regulations. This diversity is both Europe's strength and its weakness. It gives Europe enormous economic influence, but at the same time makes it difficult to move quickly as a single power. The first major problem is Europe's slowing economic growth. Although its economy remains massive, its growth rate no longer matches that of the United States or India, or several Asian economies. In the long run, geopolitical power depends heavily on whether an economy can continue growing. According to the International Monetary Fund, the EU economy is expected to grow by only around 1.1% in 2026. At the same time, economic activity such as investment and consumer spending has also slowed, while uncertainty continues to rise. This is not exactly surprising. In fact, it reflects a broader reality. Europe is entering a period of slow growth, and when growth slows, governments have less room to invest in defense, technology, infrastructure, and social welfare. Companies become more cautious, while ordinary people begin to feel that the cost of living is rising faster than the opportunities available to them. This is where Europe's dilemma becomes clear. Europe wants to continue protecting its welfare systems, lead the global climate agenda, compete with the United States and China in technology, and build stronger military capabilities of its own. But all of these goals require enormous spending. And when economic growth is weak, even wealthy nations begin facing budget constraints. One of the main reasons behind this problem is productivity. Simply put, productivity refers to how much value workers and the economy can generate within a certain period of time. When productivity rises, wages can increase, companies can expand, and economies can keep growing without relying entirely on population growth. Reports show that the gap between the EU and the United States has widened due to Europe's slowing productivity growth. EU labor productivity once nearly matched the United States, rising from around 22% in 1945 to 95% in 1995, but has now fallen back below 80%. One major reason is that Europe failed to capitalize on the early digital revolution as effectively as the United States did. The United States produced companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, Nvidia, and Tesla. Meanwhile, China built giants like Alibaba, Tencent, BYD, and Huawei. Europe is still strong in traditional industries such as automotive manufacturing, machinery, chemicals, and luxury goods. But it has struggled to create globally dominant digital companies. There is a phrase often used to describe this situation. The United States innovates, China scales, and Europe regulates. It may sound cynical, but there is some truth behind it. Europe is highly respected for regulation, consumer rights, and privacy protections. But in the digital economy, power also depends on who builds the platforms, owns the data, controls the chips, and provides the cloud infrastructure. Europe's technological weakness is most visible in AI and cloud computing. Reports show that the United States has around 40 major AI foundation models. China has about 15, while all of Europe combined has only around 3. The investment gap is even larger. Annual AI venture investment in the United States is estimated at between $60 to $70 billion, compared to only around $7 to $8 billion in Europe. The main issue is not a lack of talent. Europe still produces many highly skilled scientists, engineers, and researchers. In fact, reports suggest the EU has roughly 30% more AI professionals per capita than America. But much of this talent eventually moves to the United States because the ecosystem there is larger and more mature, offering greater access to capital, larger markets, higher salaries, bigger companies, and better opportunities to commercialize technology. At the same time, Europe's dependence on American cloud companies is extremely significant. Amazon Web Services controls around 32% of Europe's cloud market, followed by Microsoft Azure at 23% and Google Cloud at 10%. Overall, American providers dominate roughly 72% of the European cloud market, while European companies hold less than 20%. Another factor making Europe appear weaker is the high cost of energy. For years, Europe's industrial strength, especially in Germany, depended on stable and affordable energy supplies. But after the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, disruptions to Russian gas supplies, and rising geopolitical tensions, this model began showing serious weaknesses. According to the European Parliament, industrial gas and electricity costs in the EU remain far higher than in the United States and Asia. This directly affects competitiveness and corporate investment decisions, especially in industries such as chemicals, fertilizers, steel, automotive manufacturing, semiconductors, and heavy industry. When energy becomes expensive, factory operating costs rise, and products become less competitive. Companies may delay investment, move production elsewhere, or choose locations in America or Asia instead. In today's environment, factors like energy costs, speed of project approvals, government incentives, and access to raw materials are becoming increasingly important in determining where investment flows. If slow economic growth is today's challenge, demographics may become Europe's biggest long-term problem. Europe's population is aging rapidly, and this affects not only society, but also economic and geopolitical strength. According to Eurostat, the median age in the EU rose to 44.9 years in 2025, compared to 42.8 years in 2015. At the same time, the old age dependency ratio has reached around 33.9%. In simple terms, roughly 3 working people are now supporting 1 person aged 65 or older, and the situation is expected to become even more difficult. Eurostat projects that this ratio could approach 60% by the year 2100. That means fewer workers will have to support a much larger retired population. Another sign of Europe's weakness can be seen in defense. After World War II, Europe's security depended heavily on the NATO alliance, led primarily by the United States. This allowed Europe to focus more on welfare, infrastructure, and economic development, while much of the security burden was carried by Washington. But after the war in Ukraine, Europe began realizing that economic power alone is not enough without military capability. According to NATO, all allies are now reaching or exceeding the target of spending 2% of GDP on defense by 2025, compared to only 3 countries in 2014. This shows that Europe is increasing its military capabilities. But at the same time, it also exposes an old weakness: decades of underinvestment in defense. At the 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, allies also agreed to raise defense spending commitments to as much as 5% of GDP by 2035, including at least 3.5% for core defense spending. The question is, can Europe afford all of this without cutting welfare programs, raising taxes, or increasing debt? This is Europe's strategic dilemma. People want stronger security, but they also want strong social systems. Europe is also facing growing political fragmentation. Across many countries, populist, nationalist, and anti-establishment parties are gaining support. Issues such as migration, the cost of living, national identity, climate change, and relations with the United States are deepening divisions within European societies. At the same time, the EU often moves slowly because it must balance the interests of many different countries. Germany and France are not always aligned. Poland and the Baltic states focus heavily on the Russian threat. Hungary often takes its own position, while Mediterranean countries are more concerned with economic and migration issues. In stable times, this system appears cautious and democratic. But during crises, that same slowness becomes a weakness. The United States can act as a single nation. China can move through centralized authority. But the EU must go through long negotiations before major decisions can be implemented across all member states. This does not mean European democracy has failed, but it does explain why Europe struggles to behave like a traditional superpower. So, is Europe truly weak? The more accurate answer is this: Europe is not weak in absolute terms, but it is becoming weaker relative to other powers. Overall, Europe remains extremely important. It still has a massive market, the euro currency, strong institutions, experienced diplomacy, global corporations, and regulatory standards that influence the world. Many countries still want access to the EU market, and many global companies must comply with European regulations because the market is simply too large to ignore. But compared to other major powers, Europe is increasingly falling behind. The United States leads in technology and defense. China moves faster in industry. Meanwhile, India and much of the global south are growing with larger and younger populations. Europe now sits somewhere in the middle, not collapsing, but no longer leading. If Europe continues moving too slowly, remains too divided, and becomes too comfortable with past success, it may eventually become a very wealthy continent that no longer shapes the direction of the world. And that is the real question behind the title, Is Europe Getting Weaker? Not whether Europe will disappear tomorrow, but whether Europe can still remain a major player in a world that is becoming far harsher, far faster, and far less forgiving.